question. So did Michael Phelps, is that really his last one? I mean, is he going to come back 4 years from now and do it again? He's been saying this is the end, and yet when you are that much superior to everybody else, I just question it. Okay, let me give you an easier one. Who's going to win the, don't answer this, who's going to win the election in November? You don't know that. Nobody knows that, do you? How about today, the Indians game? Who's going to win that one? Well, we know the Indians will win, but that's not guaranteed, is it? Telling the future. Everybody wants to know what the future is going to be. Will Phelps be back? Who's going to be in the White House? Probably they're all going to be in the doghouse, but who's going to win this game, that game? Who's going to be doing good? Who's not going to do well? We kind of want to know what's going on in the future, but there may be some things we don't want to know. And there's probably a lot of things that you and I will go through in life that, boy, it's just better not to know that. We don't need to know that kind of information. There are people who spend a lot of time, waste a lot of money on things like astrology, horoscope, mediums. I find it interesting when I drive into Worcester on Route 3 and there's that one palm reader place there. I have no idea. So, very interesting. I don't know what Phelps will do. I don't know what the Indians are going to do. Kind of know what the Browns will do, but there's a lot of things I don't know. But what if someone could tell you with incredible accuracy what's going to happen, not today, not November, not 4 years, what about 575 years from now? Or maybe 2,000 years from now? That would be amazing. We've been going through the book of Daniel, and so far, the first 6 chapters are what I call fun Sunday school stories for us, because they're kind of exciting. Now, I wouldn't want to be Daniel or his 3 friends and go through those, because they're not just Sunday school stories. They are very real. They are very true. They happen. God did those amazing, great things. There was a lot of action, so they were easy to talk about, fun to study. That's why I call them Sunday school things, because there's a lot of action in it, and it came out pretty good, at least for the good guys, they did. But we come to chapter 7, and Israel is still in captivity. They're still in Babylon. Jerusalem still isn't built up yet. And they kind of wanted to know, how is this going to end? Now, it's a couple chapters later that you'll find out that Daniel comes across the writings of Jeremiah and learns and discovers and puts it together. And maybe he understood this before, but realizes that Jeremiah prophesied this judgment, and it was only going to be for 70 years. And Daniel's kind of figuring out that, hey, we're coming up on that. It's getting pretty close to that. He also realized and knew, and I think he knew this from day one, that they were in captivity for a reason. There was a reason why this happened to them. Okay, from the historical viewpoint, the reason was some guy named Nebuchadnezzar was getting bigger and badder and more powerful, and so he was just flexing his muscles all across the region, and he took over this place, and he took them out and brought them to himself. But in the greater picture, far beyond what Nebuchadnezzar even understood, God knew that Israel was put in captivity because of sin. They had sinned greatly. They were following idols and got so involved in idolatry. And a lot of theologians think that this Babylonian captivity almost once and for all solved them of that problem, because they were so entrenched with idolatry around them that they pretty much became sick of it. But there also was the lack of obedience. There were certain things that God had set up for Israel to do. They were to practice on a regular basis, and they didn't do it. The year of Jubilee, things like that. And so God said, this is how you've been acting. I'm going to put you into a place where you will be brought under judgment. So God was about to reveal to Daniel so he could tell his Jewish friends and everyone the extent of that judgment that was going to be brought before them. If you remember from chapter 2, and we really didn't go into it that deeply, but in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this vision of this gigantic statue, and he didn't understand it, and so he asked Daniel and others to interpret. Daniel was the only one who could tell him the dream, and then also tell him what it meant. Well, here in chapter 7, it's Daniel who has the vision, and it's a vision of all kinds of different wild beasts and animals. The message is pretty similar. There's a little bit more detail this time, because God's going to reveal to them exactly where this world is heading. It's amazing. It's amazing. We have trouble saying 4 years from now what's going to happen, and God is going to tell them basically the next 2,000 years of history and what's going to happen to them. For us, some of what happens in chapter 7 is already history. It's done, and we can look back and marvel at the details of what God had foretold to Daniel. But for them, it was all prophecy. It was all prophecy to them. Some of this in chapter 7 is still prophecy for you and I. It hasn't come true yet, but it will. Someone said that this vision of Daniel provides the most comprehensive and detailed prophecy of future events to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. And that's true, and that may be true even as you go through the rest of the book, because Daniel is going to have other visions after this. There's the ones of the ram and goats, and those equal different kingdoms. The 70-week prophecy is huge. That's a huge prophecy that Daniel gives. It helped date the coming of the Messiah. And we also connect our prophetic scheme of the tribulation period and other things to that prophecy of Daniel that he'll give in just a couple other chapters. Eventually, he talks about all the nations and how they're going to end up. He even introduced to us the concept of an antichrist that's going to come at the end times. So Daniel's prophecies are really, really important. And they're later on elaborated on in the New Testament, and particularly the book of Revelation, that spells out a lot of the detail that Daniel introduces. So this is just a broad outline of all these different prophecies and how they relate to each other. I have to be honest and say that there is some debate among liberal people and Bible scholars as to the writing of the book of Daniel. I lean toward that Daniel wrote this himself, so it was written in the 500s of BC. Some feel that some look at it and say there's no way that he could have had that accuracy. So he didn't write it. It was written much later, like 200 BC. I read that if you need to know that answer, and that's a struggle for you, I have a pile at home. There's about 20 different commentaries I will loan to you. You can read them all if you want. I have many times, and I'm absolutely convinced that this was a writing of Daniel, and that this was genuine prophecy that was given. And by the way, I think God can do that. I think he knows the beginning from the end. So it doesn't throw me for a loop at all. I think the liberal criticism is easily handled and answered, but there are some that will still cling to that. So let's take a look at Daniel's vision, verses 1 through 3. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dreams. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up and out of the sea. Well, this is kind of an interesting prophecy, Daniel's first vision. The year's probably around 553 BC. It's about 14 years after or before the fall of Babylon. It takes place between chapters 4 and 5 chronologically in the book of Daniel. So that kind of throws you off because now we're going backwards in time. Nebuchadnezzar probably died about 9 years prior to this. And this tells us that this is the very first vision that Daniel had been given. Prior to this, others had visions and things happened, and Daniel was brought in to interpret and to give understanding. But this is the first time that he himself had a vision from God. And there's some things that very similar to chapter 2, but some things pretty unsimilar. For instance, in chapter 2, this vision was given to a heathen king, Nebuchadnezzar, and he's presented with the world history and what it's going to look like. And to him it was given in the form of an image, a statue of a man. In chapter 7, not a heathen king, but this was given to the godly prophet, Daniel. And it depicts history not as a huge statue, but in 4 horrible beasts that are portrayed here. In chapter 2, Daniel's the interpreter. In chapter 7, an angel from God is the interpreter. In chapter 2, we consider history from man's viewpoint. Here, Nebuchadnezzar, here's what it's going to be like the next bunch of kingdoms, powerful and slick and sleek. But chapter 7, it shows it from God's viewpoint. Immoral, brutal, depraved. So Daniel has this, and in verse 2 he says, and I looked at this. To me, this phrase, that comment, those words, I looked, is probably the most understated thing that you could read today. It really literally means with very great intensity, I started trying to figure this out. I'm looking at this, I'm analyzing this, I am engrossed in what I have just experienced. And you're going to see this said throughout in different ways. Every time he talks about a different image that comes up, he is just blown away by this. He's trying to get definition and meaning of it. And then also in verse 2, he talked about the winds of heaven. Just to let you know, there's a lot of imagery here, and I don't want to get bogged down in interpreting every little thing, but just to give you an idea, it's probably speaking about, because it does often in the Old Testament, when it talks about the winds and the heavens, it's usually talking about the presence of deity being there. And then when he says about the great sea, most think that it's either the sea of humanity or the sea of the nations that were around at that time. So he's having this huge vision, and out of the sea of humanity, out of the sea of the nations, 4 beasts come up. So the first beast is found in verse 4. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. So the first beast is a lion. It's got wings like an eagle. A lion in their culture and in ours was considered one of the most majestic beasts there was. We still use lions to portray royalty and power. He's the king of the beasts. Some of the imagery here really points to, I think, Nebuchadnezzar. When it says that he was given feet like a man and the heart of a man, he was stood up. Remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar just prior to when he died and toward the end of his rule, which I think really humbled him and brought him to a wonderful, great, saving type relationship with God at the end of his life. This mighty, maybe one of the world's greatest ever rulers, was totally humbled when he was made to live like a beast in the fields. And this is the lion that is talking about. A lion represents one of the kingdoms. And the second one is verse 5, and it says, there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. So you have this bear lying on his side, and he's got 3 ribs in his mouth, and it makes you wonder, what in the world is it talking about? What we know about bears are that they're powerful, ferocious, but I think most people would consider them a little less majestic, a lot less swift, and less glorious than a lion. The great Hebrew scholar Driver says this, that the bear is inferior to lions in strength and appearance, and is heavy and ungainly in its movement. I like that, heavy and ungainly in its movement. I think of the golden bears of Wayneville, but anyhow, that's okay. It's soccer season, I'm sorry. The command was given to it to devour flesh, to go out and just conquer. The third beast is found in verse 6. And it says, after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. A leopard with 4 wings on its back. Again, a leopard compared to, I'm thinking of a lion, compared to a lion is less grand and less majestic, but it is swifter. And a lot of people and a lot of animals feared the leopard, because the leopard would lie in wait for its prey and then pounce on it with tremendous speed and agility. You've seen them on TV, how they can just turn on a dime. They're amazing. And when it talks about the wings, it's probably talking about the great speed that it has. Now, there is one Old Testament scholar a while back that translated this as a panther instead of a leopard, but almost universally that most people accepted as a leopard. So the fourth beast in verses 7 and 8. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now that's different, isn't it? Did you notice a lion, a bear, a leopard? What was the 4th animal? Doesn't say. But the descriptions of it, it's not specific to any kind of animal that I know. In some ways, it was too horrific to be specific. This one's dreadful, terrible, and exceedingly strong, very vicious and aggressive. And yet it represents one of the future kingdoms of the world at that time. So let's read on. In verses 9 and 10, we're going to see, now we're going to be introduced to the Ancient of Days. It says, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, and his hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. I don't think you need a lot of help with this, but this is a reference to God. This is a reference to Jehovah God in his purity in heaven. Later on, Daniel introduces the idea, and we'll see this, of the Son of Man, which is a reference to Jesus. When it describes him in this fashion, it's not trying to tell us that God is an old, feeble person. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about his purity when it describes all the light around him. It's talking about his eternality. God existed before this world came into existence. God always existed. There's no beginning with God. There's no end with God. He is eternal. What I like too is the reference to the thousands and thousands and 10,000s and 10,000s. And I just wrote innumerable saints and angels that surround him. I wonder what the population of heaven is going to be like. How many are going to be there? I'm guessing billions. I really do. I think there's going to be billions of people, let alone the angels, when we get there. God He created us to be with him for eternity. And the amazing thing about that is, even though God has billions of people and angels and everything around, somehow, some way, you still are unique to him. And he's still very focused on you as much as anyone else or anything else. Verses 11 and 12 tell us that the beast, that fourth beast, is going to be destroyed. Then I continue to watch because of the boastful words of the horn was speaking. By the way, just to fill you in, most people look at that as a reference to the future Antichrist. And I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. And in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Here's the first reference in the Old Testament to the Messiah being the Son of Man, Jesus. We're looking right now, staring into heaven and seeing what's going on in the future. And this is obviously the Lord Jesus Christ, because he's the only one worthy of ruling all the nations and all of heaven. He's the only one that we're told that's going to come in the clouds of heaven. He's the only one that we're told that will be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So now we need an interpretation of all this. And verse 15 through 18, it says, I, Daniel, was troubled in the spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Daniel was troubled. I think he was troubled by his lack of understanding. It was overwhelming to him. I think he was troubled by the immensity of this revelation. He was just told what's going to happen in the next 2,000-3,000 years or more. I think he was troubled by the nature of the direction of where the world is going. Here he is living in Babylon, and he's consumed with day-to-day affairs. Even though he was significant over the kingdom, he still had his own little world that he was living in, and now he's just been revealed as to what all is going to go on in the future, and it's not a pretty picture. And in this interpretation, he's told that there's four beasts and there's four kingdoms. So if you can remember back, that first beast, the lion, represents Babylon. And Babylon lasted about 100 years or so, and that was pretty clear. The lion was their symbol. That was pretty neat. Then there's the Medo-Persian kingdom, which lasts about 200 years. Remember the three ribs? It was divided into three rulerships, and that came true. Then about the year 336, Alexander rises up and creates this Greek empire that was massive. He started up in Macedonia, and he went all the way down into Africa, and then after he conquered everything in between there, then he went toward the east, toward India, and he just built an amazing kingdom. He expanded it more and more and more, and then it was divided into four rulerships. You know, Alexander the Great did not live very long. He only ruled himself for like a dozen or so years. He died of sexually transmitted diseases and was a young man when he died. And then that last indescribable animal beast is the Roman Empire. which comes in at about 241 BC and goes, in essence, to about 1453 AD, almost 1,700 years. And there's a lot of ways, and did you remember that one phrase in here that said that they kind of continued on? There's a sense in which we're still heavily influenced by the Roman Empire and how it existed. We have a lot of thought that goes their way and a lot of cultural things that are influenced by them. So here's Daniel, and he's understanding all this kind of stuff. Now, as the text goes on, he's told that there's another kingdom yet to come. It's God's kingdom. It's a kingdom that God is going to rule. It's going to bring to end all these other things. He's going to shatter this world the way it exists now, and things are going to be a lot different. So you're Daniel, and you've been through all this stuff in your life. You've seen, you were moved, you were captured, you were taken to another land, you were trained in another culture, another language. You've been under the rulership of other nations, and you're around them, and you're just, every day you're bombarded with just different cultural things, and your life is just in turmoil all the time. You've been through so much. Why would God give him this vision? Well, there's probably lots of reasons, and I may not have the main one, but there's a couple, like maybe God was trying to tell Daniel, you and my people Israel are still very much a part of my plan. I haven't set you aside. I haven't rejected you. Yeah, you're being judged for your sin. I told you were going to be judged for your sin. But I still love you. You're still my chosen ones, and you're still a part of what's going to happen. Maybe he wanted to give Daniel great hope in the promises that he has. Life was very difficult for him, very difficult. And yet God had these promises out in front of him that he was going to be able to claim and enjoy. He hasn't seen them yet, and some of these things he's not going to see. But they're still there. And God maybe wanted to tell him and everybody else that my kingdom is sure. It's going to come. I have predicted this. I'm going to tell you who the next great power on earth is going to be. And then I'm going to tell you who the great power after that's going to be. Then I'm going to tell you about the great kingdom that comes after that that's going to last a long time. I will give you names and dates and characteristics, and I'm going to tell you everything about that. So that as you see this materialize, you understand that God is sovereign and in control. And if he's in control of all the powers of the world and all the nations of the people, can he be in control of your life too? Doesn't he know what's going to happen for you? God showed Daniel and Israel what was ahead. He told them everything. And it proves his control over the affairs of men. God was in control. God is in control. They could trust God. And so can we today. We can trust God with the issues of our lives because he is in control. Our world is chaotic. It's out of control. We don't know it. We don't understand it. But God does. And God is still on the throne. God is still going to have his way. God is still going to accomplish what he has promised and what he has said is going to happen. And he's going to be great in his grace toward you and I. Let's pray together. Father, how we thank and praise you for the goodness of Jesus Christ and what he has brought to us in our lives. Thank you so much for the forgiveness of sin, the victory over sin that we can have in Jesus. Thank you so much for the empowering of the Holy Spirit that comes upon us all the time, and day by day you're with us, ever-present help in our time of need. Thank you so much for the promise of the future that is secure, no matter what else happens in the kingdoms of this world, no matter what happens in the events of our own lives. that, God, you have promises held out for us, wonderful, great promises that we will enjoy forever. Thank you so much for your grace. God, help us in our hearts and our lives to live for you. Bring to our minds, convict us of our sin, bring to mind areas of our lives that we need to release to you. And may you receive honor and glory because of what we do in our hearts, what we live out in our lives, what we do in service for Christ. We pray in his name. Amen.